Perfect. Well, I think this is going to be pretty casual, but I am really grateful for the chance to be here and to talk a little bit more. Just, it's funny because I think I originally started thinking about this idea of surviving times of uncertainty about a year ago, maybe a little more. And here, now we're still here. We are still in the times of uncertainty and we are still surviving. It looks a little bit different. And before, I think about a year ago, we were talking about the uncertainty of whether or not to disinfect your groceries and whether it was safe to bring your mail inside. And I think now there's still uncertainty, but it looks a little bit different. It might be about whether or not we feel comfortable going somewhere. It might be whether or not we feel comfortable asking someone if they've been vaccinated, traveling, meeting friends, these things. There's still a lot of uncertainty, but it is definitely starting to look a
Peggy?
little different. Um,
Well, I'm okay. How are
Linda,
you?
Linda, if you could mute yourself, that would be great.
no problem. The joys of Zoom, right? And so what I want to talk about is just this idea, and some of you may be familiar with it, but this idea of a window of tolerance. So, the idea of a window of a tolerance is the idea that we all have kind of this range in which we can function. And that and this is, I'm talking mostly emotionally or anxiety wise or just distress wise, that we have kind of this range where we can handle a stressor and move on with our day, where we can roll with the punches, for lack of a better term. And it's the idea too that then, so I don't know, an example I always give here is I remember one time, um, I was sleep deprived. I think I was hungry. And and I think there'd been some other stuff going on at work. And I went to buy coffee and I had cash. And for some reason, they were not taking cash. And this just threw me. And I think I remember like almost tearing up a little bit. And this little thing threw me, what I would say is outside my window of tolerance. And in that case, I think it was above my window of tolerance. So when you're above your window of tolerance, you see more anxiety, you might see more conflict, you see high energy. On the flip side, some people, when they encounter a stressor, might go below their window of tolerance. And that looks more like shutting down, isolating, things like that. Um, and what is key here is the idea that how big our window of tolerance is changes emotionally from day to day, from moment to moment. So some days our windows are bigger and some days our windows are smaller. Some days and moments, they look different. And so, when I went to go get that coffee and they weren't taking cash, if I had gotten enough sleep the day before, if I hadn't been going through these things, I don't think it would have thrown me in the same way. And I think it can be really disorienting to us, to the people around us, when different things affect us differently at different times. And what I think the window of tolerance and kind of understanding that concept really does is help give some context and help make it make sense about why that is, and what that looks like. So I think what we can say pretty definitively is that uncertainty is something that makes our window of tolerance a little bit smaller. Um, and if you think about the fact that we have, as a human, in the human experience in our world over the past year, been just constantly flooded by uncertainty, I think a lot of our windows might be smaller in general than they would have been a year ago. And they might fluctuate more quickly than they were before COVID. And what throws us out of our window might be a little bit or a lot bit different than it was before all of this. So I kind of want to pause there, and I'm curious if anyone has any thoughts on that, questions, experiences like where they're like, yes, this is a time I saw myself, my kid, go inside or outside my window of tolerance.
I actually, I'm at SLU School of Medicine, and I was meeting with a bunch of students last week, and they're first year students, and they're taking brain and behavior now, which is highly, highly stressful. So this is really a way of talking about this in medical speak. When we think of depression, one of the treatments we use are the treatments that affect our serotonin levels. And so because they've been under so much stress with studying and the whole unpredictability of the year, I'm like, this is when I think of my serotonin levels as being really low, just to validate that feeling of, oh, even if I got enough sleep, even if I'm eating well, even if I'm exercising, there's just this feeling of I've hit a wall and everything just feels a little overwhelming. So I realize that it's more medical speak than we need, but I think of it that way just to help myself remember that our brains wear out. And as our brains wear out, we need recovery time. And it's not just a matter of let's be tougher, let's beat ourselves up. We just have to recognize a full body toll for this kind of chronic stress.
I love that. And I think like actually I really appreciate the idea of, this when I'm talking about window tolerance, I'm talking about it emotionally, kind of thinking about it with anxiety and everything right now. But this is true for us as humans in all sorts of ways. Another example, which is more physical, but is body temperature, right? That if we get overheated, our bodies react to try to maintain that homeostasis. And same if it gets too low, they shut down. You think of hypothermia or overheating. And we have this range where we can function. And even with serotonin and chronic stress, there's a point at which you're outside that window and it's just going to take some time to get back in. There is no quick fix. So thank you for sharing that. Anyone else want to chime in there? Any thoughts?
One of the things I thought was interesting, you said that the window of tolerance can change throughout the day. I don't think of that so much as I always think, okay, well, it's either a great day or not. But I certainly see that as if I've had a great day or something happen at home and or work, it certainly changes how I communicate with my spouse. So, and I'll say, oh, some happened today. So
Absolutely.
So I think of that thinking, oh gosh, that's why I take a walk. That's why I take a walk when I get home from work.
Absolutely. And I think we see this in relationships, right? And I think Janet mentioned like I'm a newlywed, so I'm certainly figuring this out. But there are days when my husband might say like, hey, something about the dishes, right? And there are times when that's not going to bug me. And there are times that is not going to go well for either of us. And that's partly because of how big my window of tolerance is at that moment. Yeah, go for it, Kathy.
I'd like to share when on this vacation, I just wasn't feeling up to my energy level wasn't very high compared to the three others in the group. And when it's like I have a theme that goes way back of feeling invisible. And they're all high energy and you had to go up hills and down hills, and just to go to the bathroom I had to go down this steep incline and follow a creek, and there's rocks and roots, and I mean I was so exhausted. I didn't feel grumpy. It was also gorgeous, but it was a weird feeling because I exercise around here, but it's like I mean, I was totally exhausted. Then we'd stay up later because we're playing this game. And I would just not be able to think. It's like I just was like, blah, 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 blah. And I can't say I was depressed, but I certainly wasn't high in energy. But it was more feeling like everybody else is fine. And so it's that feeling of what's wrong with me? I'm
Mm-hmm.
I'm invisible.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that makes sense because it's not depressed. And I'm mostly in that high energy level. And I do take medicine for an anxiety disorder.
Mm-hmm.
So trying to be in the middle is really hard for me.
Absolutely. And I think, to your point, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think something then I think you brought up, which I want to spend a minute on here, is that so this safe space that we see in the middle of this picture. So not only does that change, but let's say you dip below it. Can it look like depression? Can it look like, a really significant mental health concern? Yes. Can it also look like all I have the capacity for right now is to sit on the couch and watch Netflix? Yes.
Mhm.
Can it look like I do not have the oomph to get up and let the dog out right now? Yes. Can it look like I just need to sleep? Yes. Or I don't have the energy to play that game? Yes. And on the flip side, above it, can that look like really significant anxiety? Yeah. Can it look like um being more irritable? Yes. So we may go up and down between these, but it's not always a really what I would call significant or deep depression or even really significant anxiety. It can just be feeling a little tired or feeling, I see that word overwhelmed on top too, right? And I think that overwhelmed feeling is something that a lot of us are really accustomed to feeling at different points in the day.
I think overwhelmed might kind of hit
Mm-hmm.
on, sometimes it's just like, what word is it for what's going on? Um, what I noticed in being home is I'm very active, but I'll rest a lot. It's
Mm-hmm.
like there's a sofa and you can lie flat for just a few minutes, no more than 20, and then go on. But up there, you couldn't do that.
Nope.
It was just like boom, boom, boom. But what I didn't understand is like there was like a brain fog.
Mm.
And maybe that has something to do. I think it was it was a higher altitude, but
Mm-hmm.
I mean it's exhausting. And
Mm-hmm.
yet on the other hand, like it was a 2-day drive up and a 2-day drive down, the scenery in the Poconos and in the Catskills was just amazing. And then in the car, we were also listening to that book called Sapiens, which is an 18
Oh,
hour. Well, that's a lot of food for thought, and that's where I kind of thrive, intellectually something to tell. But there wasn't anything that I could really do of importance. And yet it was a good visit with the kids.
absolutely.
You know,
And
I, I can name all kinds of positives, but I was in a brain fog and overwhelmed physically.
mhm. And yeah, overwhelmed. And the other thing you're saying that just kind of I wonder about is the idea too that things that maybe wouldn't have put us outside our window um a year ago do now. I remember the first time I went out to eat. It was kind of stressful. I was exhausted afterwards.
Really? Huh.
And I think it's just because haven't done it in such a long time, right? I think about that with traveling. And something like that may take a whole lot more thought and energy now than it did. Because is it safe? Like, is all of these questions. And I think that makes a lot of sense, honestly, that it would feel overwhelming and exhausting.
Well, I like this discussion because it gives me like a graphic visual of that helps me understand what was going on.
Hmm.
I'm very visual. So,
I like visuals too, so I can certainly
but staying
relate.
that dotted line is really, I mean, really hard for me.
Well, and I would argue it's not possible. Like none of us stay um on that dotted line always and forever. Because if we did, then we also wouldn't be experiencing things like joy.
It would be boring.
Um, yeah,
It would be terrible.
because if we numb or if we don't experience those difficult or harder emotions like anxiety, sadness, things like that, we lose the other side of the coin too, which is the joy and the love, and the excitement and things like that. And so I think the goal is not to stay in the middle. The goal is often to make our windows of tolerance as big as possible and get gain, continually grow in our skills to get back in our window when we get out.
One thing that I am very conscious of doing is taking time to breathe deeper.
Mhm. Yes.
And I seem to need to do that more.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I think even if there hadn't been the past year, let's say COVID hadn't existed, and there hadn't been any major stressors, that might still be the case. And I also think a lot of times there may be seasons in life where we need to stop and breathe more or slow down, and there may not be an identifiable cause. And that's also normal, really. And I'm actually going to show really a little in a few minutes. I'll share one of my favorite breathing exercises too. So maybe that'll be something that you can add on to or something that you might find helpful too. But thanks for sharing, Kathy. I really appreciate that.
Oh, there's one more thing I
Yeah.
want to share. I just don't follow the norm. This
Mhm.
COVID thing has been fantastic for me working on Genie. I've been able to accomplish all kinds of things because of COVID that I would not have been otherwise. And for most people, it's not that way. So it's sort of like, it's like I feel really different than the other people around me.
Well, and what I wonder is we were talking at Caring Counseling this week about how for some folks, actually, this has been a time where they've thrived, because they may be folks that like that time to work or, um, and I don't know if this is true for you, but are more introverted or more homebodied. And for some folks, actually, it's going to be harder to come out of quarantine, than it was to go in. And so, I also think people may not talk about that as much, but you're certainly not alone in that.
Yeah. But you get the gist of what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And I am confident that you are not the only one there.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Not at all. Oh, I scrolled through way too many things. Okay. So the other piece I just will talk about too is, so we talk about creating big windows as one of the goals. So there are some ways that we can do that, that aren't reactive but proactive to really make sure we have the biggest window of tolerance possible. And again, we're not going to get this perfectly, but there are some general principles. Um, One of the things, and I think this is still true, I think this limiting media exposure. I think that was especially true kind of at the beginning of this when for a lot of folks it was very easy and to just watch the news all day and try to find out what was happening and what the latest recommendations or numbers or things were. And I think that made people's windows a lot smaller. I would say that's still true, but maybe in a little bit of a different way now. Um, and then one of the things I talk about a lot in with my clients and in therapy is the idea of halts. And it's this idea that these are all risk factors for things that make our window of tolerance smaller. So I know I used to be a nanny, and if the kiddo I was watching was hungry, whew, that window was small. Like anything. There didn't even have to be a stressor, and there was just a total meltdown if that blood sugar was low or they were hungry. I think about, alcohol use, social or not, can also be something that changes our window of tolerance, both in the moment when people may be having a glass of wine or something like that, but also afterwards if you are more tired or not feeling as well. Loneliness, one of our needs as humans is connection and community. And so not having that kind of input of social connectedness can be something that makes our window smaller as well. And is certainly something that has been a huge thing to refigure out, um, get your footing in during COVID. And then the T is tired or thirsty. Say if I don't get my 8 hours of sleep, which doesn't happen, but that affects my window. If I'm tired, my window is smaller. Same for, and I think this is one that we forget about a lot. If we aren't well hydrated, physically, our window of tolerance is smaller. And there's some good research for that too, because our bodies just don't have that basic needs met in order to allow us to tolerate as much as possible. And then same with if you're not feeling well. If you're not feeling well, your window of tolerance is going to be smaller. So I think this informs us in two ways. One is some of these things we can control, making sure we're drinking enough water, trying to get enough sleep, things like that. So we can be proactive with them and try to keep our window big. But the other thing it can inform is keeping an eye on these halts is kind of like a checkpoint of whether or not now is the time to have that difficult conversation with your spouse, your child, your neighbor. Because if any of these kind of have yellow flags or red flags, now might not be the time to have that conversation, either if someone's trying to talk to you or vice versa. And one thing I work with couples a fair amount. And one of the things I do in our work together, and I encourage them to do, is when we're going to talk about difficult things, is checking in beforehand, like, are you in your window of tolerance? I will ask that at the beginning of a difficult conversation or processing something that happened. And if either partner is not, then now is not the time to do that. And then we need to focus on getting back into the window of tolerance instead of moving forward. Because if they're already out of there, there's no way that talking about something really difficult is going to bring them back into their window of tolerance. So these are both things we can try to control, but also things we need to keep an eye out for when there is a big stressor coming, or whether we're trying to decide if it's the right time to do something that might put us further outside our window. So I'll pause there. Thoughts, questions, anything anyone wants to add after that part? Perfect. So other things we can do to keep our window of tolerance as big as possible is scheduling or trying to build into our routine those self-care activities that help keep our windows big. So for example, I wasn't always good at this, but one of the things I strive to do during particularly the stay-at-home order, was making sure every day I scheduled at least 15 minutes to just go sit outside, and not have my phone, not have anything, but just go sit. And that was one way to make sure I was getting outside. I was getting, hopefully, depending on the day, some sunshine, and getting away from just screen time all day, especially working from home and that kind of thing. Also, I know some folks say, all right, at the beginning of one of the part of their morning routine or their nighttime routine is, I'm going to spend 1 minute and I'm just going to write down or think of everything that I'm worried about right now, just like a quick list. And really building that into their routine of scheduling that time for to create that container has been really helpful for them in terms of making sure there's an outlet for that that's just built into the day. Walking, um, was another big one that I think, a lot of us are still keeping up, but that was huge during COVID because that was something that we could do, and was something I would really encourage folks to keep scheduling time for as they can. It's a great way to get outside and get some endorphins. And also, sometimes if you can go with someone, it'll also fill that social connectedness bucket. Anyone have any thoughts on other things they do, they would like to do that are really those proactive strategies at maintaining a larger window of tolerance?
One thing that I Jerry and I learned that's helpful is if you take a nap, 20 minutes is an ideal time. And you could even have like a cup of tea beforehand.
Ooh.
But like if you set the timer on for 20 minutes and then tell Alexa to play relaxing music, it just is very refreshing.
Mm-hmm.
But that 20 minutes seems to be a magical number because you don't get into real slumber, but it gives your brain a vacation and your body just feels revived.
And I would also, so another way I would say that is that it gives you just enough time to kind of get back in your window of tolerance or get
Yeah,
back towards that middle line.
yeah, physically and mentally.
Mm-hmm. Yes, which is all connected, right?
Yeah,
Because if we're outside the window physically, we're outside the window mentally, and it can go vice versa too.
And I know something that works for me is just short prayer. I just,
Yeah.
when it hits, it's just like, okay, dear God. And I do just, it's a tiny power prayer, but it's always just helped me to think through what to do now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Linda, I do that too. I call them, I don't know why I came up with this term, bullet prayers, just meaning they're really targeted.
Mm.
So if I'm going into a patient room or a meeting, something I'm anxious about, I'll just say, Dear Lord, a blessing on this meeting. And it just helps me calm down a little. And I think also be open to grace, even in an interaction where I'm feeling stressed.
I remember, I don't remember, so I worked at a summer camp for several years, in Colorado. And I remember one of, my campers once saying that she did kind of a prayer that was the same concept, but hers was help me, help me, help me, like going into a moment, and then thank you, thank you, thank you, like going out of a moment. But repeating that just 3 times, like really intentionally going in and out of particularly difficult moments or conversations was a grounding practice for her. So I love all of that. And I think, these are just a few ideas of unlimited possibilities, and different things are going to work for different people. And what works for you today may not work or be as effective in a month and a year. And so it's this continual process of trying new things, seeing what works, and going with what feels right for now. So I these are kind so we kind of touched on internally. Something I wanted to make sure, and this could probably be its own whole talk, but that I threw in here is that something that's really hard, I think, right now, um, has been setting limits and understanding that all of us have our own comfort level. And so someone may ask you to do something that you aren't comfortable with yet, or you don't know about with COVID and coming out of things and vaccines and all of this uncertainty. And so I wanted to go over just a couple pieces of setting limits externally as tools to help keep you in your window if someone asks for something or makes a suggestion that you're not yet or may not be comfortable with. And even outside of COVID, I think these are still really good skills because we all get asked to do things we're not comfortable with. So, one of the things we talk about when we talk about setting limits externally, and doing this because we need to set limits externally to stay within our window of tolerance sometimes. And ways we can do that are being clear and specific. So, someone says, hey, we're having an open house or a barbecue or whatever. And you're not comfortable doing that right now with COVID. So saying like, I'm sorry, I can't come would be clear and specific versus saying like, I don't know, I'm not sure. Or maybe I'll try to make it. So being clear and specific, taking ownership. So we need to be somewhere else. We aren't able to do that right now, but really owning that decision. And then remembering that everything is a trade off. So by saying no to going to the barbecue, I'm saying yes to following, and I know these are changing, but like the CDC guidelines, or saying yes to keeping people around me safe is an example that we've been using a lot. And vice versa. There might be a point at which by saying yes to going to lunch with my friend for the first time in a year, I'm saying no to the fear because I'm being told that this is safe now because we're both fully vaccinated. And so, kind of remembering that when you set those limits, it's a trade off. And I think that can be a really big piece of staying in our window of tolerance too when we're navigating those things externally. And I'm going to keep going just because I feel like that could probably be its own talk, but wanted to make sure we at least touched on that. So then those are kind of all proactive strategies. But I also want to talk about a few in the moment skills that we can use if we find ourselves outside of our window of tolerance and we want to get back into it. And, I know, Kathy, you mentioned that breathing is really helpful for you. And, breathing can also definitely be a really important part of a prayer practice or a meditation practice, any of that. And one of the ones that I love, I do, and I teach almost all of my clients is this idea of square breathing. Um, because when we think about deep breathing, often we think about inhaling and we slow that down. And then we might slow down our exhale a little bit, but we don't hold it. And to really get them back some physiological benefit from that, we need to do kind of a square. So normally I count to 4 for each. So that's the idea of inhaling for 4, holding for 4, exhaling for 4, holding for 4. And even as you kind of see this dot going around the square, it slows you down and really helps pace that breathing. If you have little ones in your life, another way to do this, it's not quite as slow as this, but I talk with kids about is mountains and valleys. So we trace their hands and we say we're going to inhale, and we trace their hand and then we exhale in the valleys. And Kathy, I don't know if you want to share, want to chime in, if there's another type of breathing exercise that you find helpful, or if anyone else does too.
What I'd like to know
Mhm.
is the holds. What is the significance of the 4-second holds? Because I've read about this and done it, but I tend to forget the holds.
And, and I don't know that I can speak to it in terms of physiologically, but I think in some ways it's also just the moment of being. And if we're inhaling and exhaling constantly, it's still going to be fast, even if we slow it down. And so I like it because I think for me, it gives me a moment to just stop.
It's very meditative.
It is. And, I think about how some of these bullet prayers could really be integrated with this, what I call square breathing or 4x4 breathing. And if anyone else can speak to the significance, the physiological significance of the holds, please feel free to chime in too. But any other thoughts about breathing exercises or things that folks find helpful?
You would think I could speak to the physiology of this. It's not how my brain considers it, but I'm sure there are people who study it. And I imagine back in I think in the maybe 80s and 90s, there was a big focus on biofeedback.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of it is really just, it is just a way of slowing down and being present, but how that's transmitting, I can't speak to. I do use this. I teach my I haven't taught my students this. I go through this with my patients. And when my son was little, they actually taught him 10 in, 10 out. And it was smell the flowers, so in through the nose for 10, and then blow out the candles. And then this is also so much of what yoga is about. We might think of yoga as being really complicated physical positions. It's really mainly about breathing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And there's a lot of good ways. And I think about yoga too, and I love yoga practices both, because the other word that comes to mind with yoga, with breathing, is mindfulness. And mindfulness is this idea, this could be a whole nother talk, but that there are a lot of times we're so caught up in our heads that we miss out on the present moment. And mindfulness is that process of turning to the present moment and really being here right now in this space. And that actually ties in really well with this next one. So grounding techniques is this sometimes weird sounding word, which just means, again, skills that bring us to the present moment. And when we're outside our window, I would say we are very rarely in the present moment. And so grounding techniques are just other ways of bringing ourselves back into the present moment. My favorite one is involving senses, because again, senses are something that is happening in the moment. And so paying attention to our senses brings us out of our heads and back to where we are and what's happening right now. And so this one, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, there's some different variations of this. But what I do is I say, all right, we're going to name 5 things we see. And so I'll model this right now. So 5 things I see right now are, I see there's a little light on my computer where the camera's on. I see my pen next to my computer. I have a sticky note on my wall, my coffee cup, and I also see my lamp on. And then we name 4 things we feel. And in this case, we're using the senses for the physical environment more than emotions. So I feel my hair hitting the side of my face right here. I feel my headphones that are in my ear, my chair underneath me, and my feet are on the floor. three things I hear. I hear my own voice at the moment. I can hear some birds in the background, um, and a fan running. And then for the 2 deep breaths, I usually do 2 of the square breaths. So 4, 4, 4, 4. And then one statement about where you are. So right now I would say it is Sunday morning and I'm sitting in my home office, talking with all of you lovely folks. Thoughts or questions there about that exercise?
I like this exercise, and this whole session has helped me. Like when you go on a vacation, like it helps me process this trip that we had, and that's
Good.
very. It's like a light going on, like very helpful. It's like, oh, this makes sense, and this makes sense, and when you mentioned like the times that I really enjoyed things, like the things you see and hear and feel, um, I was photographing these logs and the, little delicate things. And so those were the highs, even though everybody else was doing something else. And
Mhm.
all those things, I just feel like I have so many blessings with, you know, like right now I can see the Japanese maple in the garden and, things like that. And on the trip, there was all that surrounding me. And so that was wonderful. But this is helpful to process that feeling of, well, here I am, and here's the three of them.
Yeah, I'm
It
glad I'm glad that's helpful.
yeah,
And
it's very helpful.
I think, I think I said this probably 4 or 5 times now, but a whole other talk could be what comparison does to our window of tolerance too.
Yes.
Because
And I
when we are
really was into that.
yeah, because when there's thoughts about why am I in a different spot than they are, or why am I not, like any of those why questions about why we are where we are can be such a thief of joy and
Diminish.
put us outside our window too. Any other thoughts on the grounding exercise, breathing, anything anyone wants to add in?
Well, I would just say sometimes it gives you an opportunity to get outside of your head.
Yes.
I think about this between 2 and 4 in the morning a lot when I can't sleep.
Mm.
And I just have to, focus on something else or pray or count sheep, try
Mhm.
backwards by
To
fractions.
get
from
out of your
hundreds.
head.
So maybe, yeah, you think of something else and focus on something else. So that's great. And then I love the getting rid of the social media. I have 3 children who are in their 20s and 30s, and that if I could do one thing for our generation of children and grandchildren it would be get rid of social media and the comparisons of how,
Yeah.
and I do the same. I'm on social, I don't post so much, but I look and like, oh my gosh, well, let's see, they're having fun. I should be too. I got to go have fun. So
Absolutely.
those kind of struck me.
Yeah.
Jessica, we at St. Peter's, we had an associate many years ago, Cricket Cooper, who taught us a prayer. And I can't remember, it's like St. Teresa of Avila, maybe, I'm not sure, but it's all will be well, all things will be well, all manner of things will be well. And for me, that's always been a wonderful prayer, just to kind of calm you down and get you back in the moment.
I love that. And, I think all things will be like, you could make that into 4 counts, like pretty
Yes.
easily too, to tie into that square breathing.
Mhm.
I just also wanted to name thoughtfully that separation from our bodies may have been things that we learned as
Mhm.
kids if we were just going through something really difficult.
Yes.
And so to escape from feeling was a survival mechanism at times that may not have been safe. and reminding ourselves, part of what I think we might be doing spiritually and physically is reminding ourselves that we are safe.
Yes, absolutely. And we actually, in grounding techniques, I think are useful all the time, but one of the times it is absolutely essential is when folks are doing trauma work. And that is because trauma can be so many different things, but when you are talking about a trauma or a really difficult experience, your body can go into that same state where it shuts down a little bit and you shut down because it's trying to protect you. And it's such an adaptive and helpful response. And grounding techniques are bringing us back to, in this moment, I'm here and I'm safe. And when I do this with a client, if we're doing that, that statement at the end would include something about, it's Thursday night, I'm sitting in my living room and I'm safe. But thank you for thoughtfully bringing that in too, because yes, absolutely. I also resisted the urge to say, and that could be a whole nother talk because it could be. So the last thing, I know we're running out of time, but the last thing I will add in here too is getting support. So each of these are skills, that we can use in our practical time. But one of the things that I always try to just wrap into these type of conversations is the idea that going to see a counselor or a therapist can be and can often very helpfully be a long-term or an ongoing thing. It doesn't have to be. If you're like, hey, I really want to work on skills, I want to work on a couple of skills to get back in the moment, that is also a very appropriate use of counseling, therapy, going to see someone. And I think a lot of times I've talked with folks who are like, oh, you mean I could just go like once or twice and that would be okay? And yes, absolutely. And different places work a little bit differently, but I know at Caring Counseling, I've had many people who come in and they say, hey, and from the get-go, it's like, I want to get some skills on these one or two things. And that's fine. So I always throw in here that that is an option and that can be really helpful. Just like you might go to see your doctor or to see a physical therapist to learn exercises or things like that to address pain or an injury or things like that. Going to see a counselor, going to someplace like Caring Counseling can be a helpful thing to address ongoing issues, but also can be a really helpful, hey, I want to come in and gain some skills in X, Y, or Z. So, and that is kind of where I wanted to make sure we left a couple of minutes here at the end for just any other overall thoughts, things like that. And I will stop screen sharing so I can see all of you too. Okay, there we go. So anything else anyone wants to add, thoughts, questions?
A question.
Yeah.
Oh, you could hear me. I didn't know if I was muted or. Do you ever, you're doing this as a speaking group. Would you consider speaking to a group called Better Marriages, which is couples working on their marriages?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of these skills too, and it's funny because I think a lot of times when I work with couples, sometimes it's about doing some of the same things we would do in individual work, but doing it together.
Mm-hmm.
So learning to practice, like, are you in your window of tolerance right now? Setting limits, recognizing when your partner's outside their window, things like that. But yeah, absolutely.
Then how do we contact you?
Janet can probably help
Okay.
you get in contact with me.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll pass that along. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Jessica, do you have good strategies? So if I'm dealing with somebody and all of a sudden they're out of their window and they're in that hyper mode and they attack, which is often then my response for me, Catherine, is reflex attack back.
Of course. Yeah.
Do you have strategies, and when you were saying set limits, be clear and specific, for respectfully responding to that in a way where I'm not counterattacking, but I'm also not just being silent and sending a message that somehow that was okay?
And I think this depends a lot on different situations, but my first instinct and thought is to, if I am, for example, working with a client or have been in a situation where someone is outside their window, and I, obviously cannot attack back or things like that, I will usually say, and I try to do this in my personal life too, say like, and I think, I don't know how my friends and family feel about me using these terms all the time with them, but that's fine. I will say like, it seems like we're outside our window. I'm going to step away. Um, and also if I am in anticipating that possibly, I will also set limits ahead of time of, I have 5 minutes and then I'm going to have to go, or things like that. To know that there are limits ahead of time of when I will leave, or that there's only a few minutes. Because then, too, I think for me psychologically, if I know there is an out, or there are boundaries ahead of time, I might be able to tolerate a little bit more and stay in my window because I know I'm headed out and I'm not feeling quite as cornered. But I always think too, naming and saying like, look, this is clearly not productive. I'm going to step away.
One reason I ask, it relates to work we do here at church and also work we do at SLU. This has been a year of difficult conversations, especially we have a different ministry called Sacred Conversations, where we're learning about history of race and racism. And that can trigger some very strong responses. And so we did get some wonderful facilitation training, but it does strike me that it also fits into what you're talking with us about. And as a society, when that becomes attack, counterattack, counterattack, it's extremely destructive. And so I think I'm just eager for any wisdom in those moments, whether it's about a history I don't want to know, or it's just somebody is insulting me because they're stressed and somehow they're feeling threatened. So just welcome your wisdom.
Yeah, no, and that's such important and really difficult work. And I certainly, I don't know if this is good news or bad news, but I think that it's a lifelong thing, right? And I think I certainly wish for that magic answer too. And I think for me personally, I know, for example, that I'm much more likely to go into that defensive kind of more attack mode if I hear someone talking a certain way or saying things about people I love or people that something that I feel strongly about. And knowing that is big for me. But then I think too, my go-to is just like saying like, I'm really uncomfortable with the way you're talking. And making that statement because that is a fact. That's how I'm feeling. And not going into trying to explain why that is, because that's likely not going to be productive. At that point.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah.
Jessica, is Karen Counseling offering Zoom classes? For example, something like Catherine was talking about, or maybe just communication skills?
Yeah, so we have done some things in the past and we did over COVID. I don't think we have. So I have two answers to that. One is that we don't have anything on the docket right now that I know of, but certainly stay posted or stay tuned. And also they have a wide range of classes they offer. I want to say twice a month on Wednesdays at 10:30 that are wrapping up for the summer now, but that are kind of more continuing education can be all sorts of things, which would include some pieces like this that are over Zoom. And so if you go to the website, I don't think they have the next year's calendar up, but there's some really good stuff on there too that would be, I think, just generally interesting for anyone. It might include some of this.
Good. Just the care and counseling website.
So
Okay.
careandcounseling.org.
Great.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And if there is, if there is interest for some of these, additional topics or some things that we can collaborate with some ministries or so, we're certainly willing to, we're very open to doing that. I think the more that, it's a great way to, educate, teach, and also socialize on the screen a little bit. So
Yes.
have a little bit of connection. So please feel free to email me or let me know, or come to church and I'll see you.
I think we ought to make Jessica our permanent resource
Okay.
at care and counseling.
Have you on retainer. I'm not in charge of the budget. I'm just
Well, thank you. I love doing things like this too, because I love the way that sometimes these conversations can lead into other ones. And I always feel like I learn so much. And if you can't tell, I could probably talk about any of this, or all of those spin-off things at any time. So, just give me the platform, and I can't guarantee what'll come up, but we'll go there.
Well, that is great. And we really appreciate your time and your energy. And I have learned, she sent me the presentation prior to this, but it's amazing what comes up and how you visualize it. It's a great way of visualizing it. I'm very visual
Yes.
too, to say that window. And I think you could use that in a lot of situations. So thank you. We appreciate your time, and thanks guys for everybody being on our coffee. Next week we have Beth Goad from Episcopal City Mission. So, and then the following week, oh gosh, the speaker in Catherine, I can't remember the gal's name. We have another Sacred Conversations on May 23rd. And then our plan is to take a little hiatus from coffee, virtual coffee, for the summer. So anyway, more to come on that. But please join us the next couple of weeks, and thank you again. I have to go to church. So, all right.
Have a good day, everyone. Thank
Thanks,
you.
Janet.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Jessica.